The wind howled over the sun-scorched cliffs of Mount Ararat as Father Lucien Devoe tightened his grip around the weathered leather satchel. Hidden within was an object he had spent 23 years of his life searching for, an object whispered about in forbidden monasteries and exiled libraries. It was older than the Book of the Dead, more detailed than the Tibetan Bardo Taedal, and more feared than any grimoire the Church had ever burned. Bound in blackened vellum, written in a language scholars still debate existed, it was simply called The Testament of Amun Khan. When Lucien first heard rumors of the book in the catacombs beneath Aix-en-Provence, he had dismissed them as apocryphal ramblings from mad monks. But after uncovering identical accounts in both Egyptian and Armenian monastic texts, records separated by 2,000 miles and centuries of doctrinal fire, his doubt turned to obsession. Every scrap of knowledge pointed to one conclusion: this was no myth. Somewhere beneath layers of censorship and blood-soaked history, the book existed, and it claimed to map in stunning detail the soul's journey after death. The cover alone defied logic, stitched with metallic fibers and an organic material no lab had ever identified. It radiated a low hum, almost like breath. Scholars who glimpsed it briefly described a dizziness, a feeling of being watched. Lucien had dared only open it once, in a sealed chamber lined with sigils from the Solomonic texts. The first page did not contain words, but a glyph, a symbol that pulsed faintly in total darkness. The glyph matched a carving in a collapsed temple in Abydos, one archaeologist had long believed decorative. Lucien now knew better. The book's existence had been suppressed for over 1,000 years. The last known mention came from a Vatican scroll dated 1047 AD, which ordered the annihilation of the Testament and death by fire for any who dared replicate it. But it was too late. Copies, or rather fragments, had already spread, hidden in monasteries disguised as apocrypha, embedded in Kabbalistic diagrams, or even encoded into Gregorian chants that had long since fallen out of fashion. What Lucien held now was not a complete text, but the most intact version ever found. A flicker of movement in the shadows jolted Lucien from his thoughts. He had come to this mountaintop for isolation, yet he had the unnerving sensation that he was not alone. Not physically, but metaphysically. Since acquiring the book, strange phenomena had plagued him. Mirrors cracking in his presence, watches running backward, his own voice echoing minutes after speaking. And always the dreams, a winding staircase beneath the desert, where a black sun lit hallways of bone and glass. In the dreams he was never alone. Something walked behind him, just out of sight. He opened the book again. The pages were thin and slightly translucent, marked with inks that shimmered under certain stars but remained invisible in daylight. The first passage he dared translate described the 4 veins of passage: conduction, reflection, reconciliation, and severance. These weren't metaphors, but literal stages the soul passed through, each one governed by beings that existed in a space neither alive nor dead. One term stood out: the watcher of the 3rd vein. No description, only a warning. Do not draw its gaze. To be seen is to be remembered. Lucien had cross-referenced this phrase in a Sumerian cylinder seal held secretly at the Louvre. The same glyph appeared, but reversed, mirrored. It was as if the Sumerians knew of the book, or worse, had tried to reproduce it. He realized then that ancient civilizations may not have independently developed afterlife doctrines. They may have recovered them. Echoes from this single original text, the Testament of Amun Khan, had rippled across cultures, buried beneath layers of cultural translation and deliberate obfuscation. But why suppress it? Why burn every trace? Lucien believed the answer lay in what the book did not say, in the spaces between words, in the diagrams that depicted no recognizable geography but instead mapped something internal. The afterlife, it implied, was not a location but a recursion. A soul unprepared could become trapped in a loop, reliving its regrets, its fears, its crimes, until its essence degraded into echo. The Church feared not that the book revealed too much, but that it revealed accurately. That heaven and hell were not places of judgment, but states of repetition. Just as he reached for the section labeled the Mirror Gate, his lantern flickered. The shadows on the rock wall convulsed, stretching in unnatural ways. A sound like wet fabric tearing emerged from the corner of the chamber. Lucien turned slowly. Nothing. Yet the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees. He felt it, not a presence, but an awareness. Something in the book had looked back. He slammed the cover shut, but the damage was done. He knew the rules. Every page turned was a door opened, and not all doors closed behind you. The language of the Testament was a living structure. The act of translating it altered its reality, sometimes permanently. The margins shifted when unobserved. Entire passages reworded themselves to align with the reader's thoughts, and worse, some readers reported seeing their own names in footnotes of prophecies that shouldn't even be there. He descended the mountain by torchlight, paranoid now. The voices had started again, but not in his ears, in his thoughts. They weren't intrusive, but subtle. Memories slightly rearranged, events retold with different outcomes. A dream he had as a boy suddenly ended differently. A lover's face no longer matched the memory. Lucien clutched the satchel tighter. The book was editing him. Word of his possession spread fast, not through mouths but through whispers in hidden places. By the time he reached Prague, he was being watched, not by governments but by others like him. A silent network of seekers, mystics, and broken men. They didn't want to destroy the book. They wanted to finish translating it, to open the last 10 pages, the ones sealed with a resin that when analyzed resembled dried blood. Lucien knew. To open those final pages was to lose the boundary between life and what comes after. He checked into a monastery, posing as an abandoned observatory outside Krakow. There, beneath a false floor, he laid out the fragments he had copied. Using symbols from the Voynich manuscript and phonetics from Proto-Canaanite tablets, he managed to decipher 3 more sentences, but he stopped cold when the 3rd line read, "He who translates this passage will die twice." That night, the monastery's bells rang on their own. The wind stopped completely, all candles extinguished simultaneously. Lucien awoke to find the book open to a page he hadn't touched. The symbol on it was moving, no, breathing. His pulse accelerated. At the base of the page was a new line, not written by him. "You are remembered." It wasn't ink. It was etched into the fibers. And then the door creaked open behind him. Lucien turned slowly, and everything he thought he knew about the afterlife fractured. The door stood half open. Beyond it only darkness, dense and unbroken. Lucien didn't move, not because he couldn't, but because the air itself resisted him, as if time had grown thick. The monastery was silent, yet something breathed beyond that threshold, not audibly, but in the sensation of air being displaced. He could feel it, like a great lung expanding slowly just out of reach. He reached for the satchel, only to find it missing. The book was still on the table, but its weight felt different, as if it had aged further in the last few moments. He touched its cover and recoiled. It was warm. The symbol on the open page had ceased breathing, but it had changed shape, slightly, subtly. The lines curled in tighter spirals now, resembling the spine of a fetus curled in utero. The text beneath had shifted again. What once read, "You are remembered," now read, "You were chosen." He backed away, but the shadows from the hallway advanced into the room. Light no longer behaved properly. His lantern cast silhouettes where there were no bodies. One took the form of a man with a bifurcated skull, another, a child with no mouth, and one, the tallest, stood completely still, arms outstretched as if inviting him to embrace it. Lucien tore a line of protective salt around the desk, a practice he had learned in an Ethiopian monastery rumored to protect readers of forbidden texts, but even before he completed the circle, he knew it was useless. This presence didn't threaten him from outside, it was inside, not possession, no, this was worse. The book had altered his perception. It was showing him what was already here, all around him, visible until now. The page turned itself. No breeze, no hand. But the page lifted, floated upward, and fell to reveal an illustration. It showed a gate, not architectural but organic, a vast structure of bone and blood vein arches, suspended in an eternal twilight. At the center, a figure kneeled backward, its face twisted entirely around, gazing at the reader with pale, lidless eyes. Above it was written, "The mouth that speaks only truth." The text below described a ritual, one that could not be performed in the physical world, yet one the reader would be compelled to experience. It was known as the descent of recollection. According to the Testament, each soul carried a gate within, closed by trauma, denial, and guilt. The ritual opened it, but to pass through meant reliving not just one's memories, but how they were seen by others, every thought, every resentment, every secret spoken in silence. The true afterlife was not judgment, it was witness. Lucien staggered to his knees. The room was spinning now, but not from dizziness. The very geometry had shifted. The corners were no longer 90 degrees. The ceiling stretched upward like a cathedral's vault, though it had once been flat. The book's influence was manifesting physically now, changing space around it to mirror its internal architecture. He needed help. He needed the others. There was one man who might understand. Professor Daoud Malach, a former Dead Sea scholar who had vanished in 1997 after claiming the Essenes possessed a counter-Torah, a document they swore was dictated by an entity from beyond death. Lucien had his last known address, a ruined observatory in Cappadocia. If the testament was real, Daoud had seen a piece of it. The next morning, Lucien left before sunrise. He buried the book in a lead-lined chest beneath the monastery's chapel and sealed it with a Hebrew sigil designed to trap intent. Not spirit, intent. For what he feared most wasn't that the book was alive, but that it wanted something. The journey to Cappadocia blurred. Time stretched in odd ways. Lucien slept for hours but awoke minutes later. Shadows at the edge of his vision remained longer than they should. Once he swore he saw a page from the book floating beside a truck on the highway. Then it vanished. He arrived days later, exhausted and uncertain whether time had passed normally. The observatory was exactly as Daoud had left it, circular, covered in ivy, its dome collapsed. Lucien forced the door open and descended into the lower chambers, where ancient planetary models lay rusted and overgrown. In the center was a chair made of bone, and seated in it, eyes open but unmoving, was Daoud Malach. Lucien stepped closer, and Daoud blinked. Not dead, but not alive in the traditional sense either. His skin was marked with a lattice of scars that looked like writing. Lucien knelt beside him, whispered, "You've seen it, haven't you?" Daoud's lips moved, slowly, painfully, and he whispered one phrase. "It's not a book, it's a seed." Lucien stared in horror. If the testament was a seed, what had he just watered? He turned to flee, but the exit was gone. In its place stood a spiral stairway descending into blackness. Not constructed, not carved, round. Lucien's pulse froze. The book wasn't content being read. It wanted to be entered. He knew now, to uncover the secrets of the afterlife was not to observe, but to participate. The testament had been banned, not because of its knowledge, but because it was a doorway. A threshold into a realm where thought shaped reality and memory could create gods. A place where forgetting was the only way out, and even that was a lie. And now the stairway awaited him. Still warm, still growing, still listening. Lucien descended, one trembling step at a time, and behind him Daoud whispered one final warning in a voice not his own. "The fourth vein has opened." The stairwell spiraled downward with no discernible end, hewn from no stone Lucien recognized. It pulsed subtly under his hand. Warm, almost flesh-like, glistening with moisture. Each step was accompanied by a low resonance, like a heartbeat echoing through subterranean arteries. The deeper he descended, the more the structure felt less like a tunnel and more like a living thing. Lucien had stopped checking how far he'd come. There were no walls, no ceiling, just that endless spiral, suspended in a darkness that never quite touched him. The book was not in his possession, yet he could feel it, not behind him, not above, but inside. It had nested in him, just as Dowd said, a seed, and now it was blooming. He felt it in his spine, whispers curling up through nerves, memories leaking into his senses like ink in water. At last the staircase ended, not with a floor, but a horizon. He stepped out onto what looked like an immense plain of black glass reflecting stars that didn't exist. Above him loomed constellations he had never seen, configurations that shifted when not looked at directly. Floating stone monoliths hung in the air, carved with script that shimmered between languages. Some of the words were his own thoughts, others were not. In the distance stood a structure, neither temple nor tower. It resembled a spinal column rising from the earth, each vertebra carved into a step. Suspended above it was an orb, pulsating in rhythm with his heartbeat. He approached slowly, each footstep echoing after he made it, as if time here had lost its grip on causality. At the base of the spine was an altar. Upon it, something impossible. The Testament of Amun Khan. Lucien reached for the book, but his hand halted mid-air. A voice, not heard but felt, vibrated through his bones. It spoke in layered tongues, as if thousands were whispering the same message through a single mouth. To open again is to be unmade. And yet the book opened of its own accord. The pages flipped rapidly, faster than the eye could follow, until they stopped at a single illustration, a human face split down the center, half decayed, half newborn. Beneath it, the fifth vein, the mirror of origin. A flash, too fast for sight, blinded him. When Lucien blinked the darkness away, he was standing in a different place. Around walls covered in ancient diagrams. A candle flickered beside a brass basin filled with dark water. But this time he wasn't alone. Seated across from him was himself. A younger version, maybe 10 years prior, wearing the same cassock he had abandoned when the church disavowed him. The younger Lucien smiled. "You don't remember the moment you left, do you?" the doppelganger said softly. Lucien tried to speak, couldn't. "Because you never left. You were split. The book didn't choose you. It divided you." Memories surged, fragments of conversations that never happened, a corridor of stone filled with mirrors, a ritual he had forgotten until now, performed under the ruins of Chartres Cathedral, where he had invoked the name Amun Khan before ever knowing what it meant. He hadn't found the book. He had called it. The younger version stood and approached him, eyes turning black as obsidian. "Do you know why they sealed it away? Not because of what it revealed about death, but because of what it erased about life." "What do you mean?" Lucien croaked. "You were never meant to live only once." The world around them shattered, literally, like glass struck by thunder. Shards of memory, reflection, and unspoken knowledge spiraled into the void. Lucien screamed as he was pulled backward, his body evaporating into thought. When he awoke, he was kneeling in a vast library without walls. Books hovered in mid-air, chained to invisible spines. Scrolls unfolded themselves, whispering their contents in languages older than the earth. An entity stood in the center, tall, robed in folds of living parchment, its face a blank page. Its voice sounded like ink soaking into dry paper. "You have crossed the fifth vein. Few return." Lucien whispered, "What is this place?" The entity raised a single hand, and an image flickered before Lucien's eyes. a child's death, a tyrant's remorse, a ritual in Atlantis. All were him. All were lives he had lived. The book was not a revelation of what comes after death. It was a record of everything before. The robed entity gestured, and a new book materialized before Lucien. Its cover bore no title, only a single glyph, his own name. The ink shimmered gold and black, always in motion. "This is yours," the entity said. Lucien reached for it, but hesitated. If he opened it, he would remember everything. Every life. Every death. Every betrayal and every truth hidden behind mortal illusion. The pain would be unimaginable. But so would the clarity. "When'll me?" he asked. The entity leaned close. "Because you were willing to ask what came after, even knowing it might erase who you are." He opened the book, and the screams began. Not of pain, but of birth. For each remembered self erupted into his mind like fire, searing and blinding. He was now a mosaic of lives. A Babylonian priest burned for drawing forbidden maps of the stars. A Mayan scribe who buried a scroll beneath a pyramid. A Roman soldier who wept after killing a prophet. All him. All remembered. All real. He collapsed. And when he rose, he wasn't Lucien anymore. He was what came after Lucien. But the book wasn't finished. One final page turned. It showed an hourglass. Not filled with sand, but with names. Each name a soul. And one was missing. His. And in that moment the voice returned. Not the entities, but something older, deeper, speaking from the void he had left behind. "Now that you remember, you must choose. Return or descend further." Lucien stood between two doors, one of blinding light, the other a black spiral leading deeper into the architecture of the soul. He looked back one final time, and the book closed itself. The sixth vein opens only to those who no longer fear what they were before the first breath. The doors stood before him like the last riddle of a dead god. One radiant with blinding brilliance, warm, seductive, final. The other, a descending spiral of obsidian matter, endlessly folding inward like the pupil of an eye that had never blinked. Both pulsed with life, both called to him. Lucien stood not as the man he had been, but as a vessel of memory. Countless selves braided into one consciousness, humming like a hive. He had touched the fifth vein, he had remembered, and now the sixth beckoned. He stepped forward, toward the darkness. The spiral consumed him, not with violence, but with intimacy. It welcomed him. Each turn inward stripped away a layer, doubt, fear, identity, even language. Thoughts ceased being thoughts and became forms, symbols. Primal sounds. The stairway didn't lead to a place but to a state. Time melted, there was only depth. He arrived. It was neither above nor below. It was the nexus, a geometric womb suspended in a realm of black fire and white shadow. At the center was a throne, shaped like an hourglass shattered open. Upon it sat no one, and yet Lucien knew it had once been occupied, not by a god, not even by a soul, but by the first memory, the original consciousness, the entity that had written the testament. On the throne rested a final fragment of the book, its first page, blank yet radiant. The moment Lucien approached, words bled through, not from ink, but from his own spine. Memories, too ancient to be called his, surged into form. A name. Amun Khan. He had always wondered who, or what, it was. Now he understood. It was not an entity. It was a condition, a final state of awareness, where all lives collapse into one. The soul no longer reincarnates, no longer returns, no longer forgets. It remembers perfectly, infinitely. And Lucien stood on its threshold. Suddenly, light fractured around him. Thousands, millions of other beings appeared, flickering in and out of form, some human, some not, some grotesque, some angelic. All were reflections of possible selves. Echoes that had once split off and taken paths he did not. They encircled him, forming a spiral of memory. Then he heard the voice again. But this time it was his own. "You are now the scribe. Do you understand what must be done?" He did. To complete the cycle, he had to write the final line of the testament. But it would not be written in ink. It would be written in choice, the oldest language of all. And what he chose would echo backward through all history, reconfiguring every afterlife ever imagined. He stepped forward and saw what was waiting. A being emerged from the void, towering, composed entirely of fractured time. It wore faces he recognized. Dowd's, his younger self, even faces from dreams he'd forgotten. This was the guardian of the seventh vein, the final threshold. The guardian did not speak. It mirrored. Every movement Lucien made, it followed, identical. He understood. The last test was not violence. It was confrontation with the total self. Lucien closed his eyes. He allowed all cells to collapse inward. The priest, the heretic, the scholar, the murderer, the martyr, the child, the fool. He embraced them, loved them, forgave them. And then he stepped through the guardian. It dissolved like mist. And before him, a vast surface unfolded. Not paper, not stone, but reality itself. It was blank, waiting. And Lucien stood on its threshold. Suddenly, light fractured around him. Thousands, millions of other beings appeared, flickering in and out of form, some human, some not, some grotesque, some angelic. All were reflections of possible selves. Echoes that had once split off and taken paths he did not. They encircled him, forming a spiral of memory. Then he heard the voice again. But this time it was his own. "You are now the scribe. Do you understand what must be done?" He did. To complete the cycle, he had to write the final line of the testament. But it would not be written in ink. It would be written in choice, the oldest language of all. And what he chose would echo backward through all history, reconfiguring every afterlife ever imagined. He stepped forward and saw what was waiting. A being emerged from the void, towering, composed entirely of fractured time. It wore faces he recognized. Dowd's, his younger self, even faces from dreams he'd forgotten. This was the guardian of the seventh vein, the final threshold. The guardian did not speak. It mirrored. Every movement Lucien made, it followed, identical. He understood. The last test was not violence. It was confrontation with the total self. Lucien closed his eyes. He allowed all cells to collapse inward. The priest, the heretic, the scholar, the murderer, the martyr, the child, the fool. He embraced them, loved them, forgave them. And then he stepped through the guardian. It dissolved like mist. And before him, a vast surface unfolded. Not paper, not stone, but reality itself. It was blank, waiting.